Rain always made the city feel quieter. The traffic slowed. The sidewalks emptied. Even the brightest buildings seemed softer beneath the silver curtain falling from the evening sky. I wasn't planning to stop anywhere. I had finished photographing a small art exhibition downtown, and all I wanted was to get home before the weather became worse. My camera bag rested against my shoulder, growing heavier with every step through the rain. Then I noticed the bookstore. I'd walked past it dozens of times without ever going inside. A warm amber light glowed through its windows, and a hand-painted sign above the door read, "Hawthorne Books, Stories Find People." For reasons I couldn't explain, I stepped inside. A tiny bell chimed above the door. Books taught me how to survive it. I reached for a weathered copy of The Night Circus. Another hand reached for it at exactly the same moment. "Oh," I looked up. "So, I guess we have similar taste," the stranger said with an apologetic smile. He looked about my age, perhaps a year or two older. Dark brown hair curled slightly from the rain, and a navy sweater clung to his shoulders where it had become damp. His eyes were kind, not loud, not dramatic, just quietly observant. "You found it first," I said. He shook his head. "I'm pretty sure we both did." For a second, neither of us moved. Then we both laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, just enough to break the awkwardness. "You take it," I offered. "What if we solve this differently? I'm listening." He held up the book. "If you've already read it, you recommend something to me. If you haven't, I'll recommend something to you." I smiled. "That's surprisingly fair. I'm Julian." He extended his hand. "Rowan." His handshake was warm despite the cold weather outside. "So," Julian asked, "have you read this one?" "Twice. Worth a third." "Probably." He grinned. "I'll trust your judgment." Instead of leaving with the novel, we wandered through the aisles together, talking about stories we'd loved and endings that had broken our hearts. Some conversations feel forced. Ours didn't. Every topic naturally led to another. Books became films. Films became music. Music became travel. Travel somehow became childhood memories. "I grew up in Oregon," Julian said. "My parents owned a small bakery. That explains why you seem trustworthy." He laughed. "Does it? I've never met anyone raised around fresh bread who turned out completely terrible. I'll tell my parents that scientific fact." We reached the cafe without realizing how much time had passed. "Coffee?" he asked. I glanced toward the rain. It had become even heavier. "I don't think the weather is giving me much choice." "Good." He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say yes." We ordered 2 coffees and settled beside the window. Outside, people hurried beneath umbrellas. Julian worked as a graphic designer for a small publishing company. "I spend all day making book covers." "So you judge books by them professionally?" "Exactly." "I knew it. And you?" "I'm a freelance photographer." His eyes brightened. "I thought your camera bag looked expensive. It just looks like it survived a war." He laughed loudly enough that a woman across the cafe smiled at us. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I haven't laughed like that in a while." Neither had I. That realization surprised me. Our conversation gradually became quieter, more honest. "I lost my dad 3 years ago," Julian admitted after a long pause. "I'm sorry." He loved bookstores. He looked around the room. "I still come into places like this because they remind me of him." I understood that feeling. "My mom passed away when I was 17. His expression softened. "You still miss her?" "Every day." He nodded without trying to fix my sadness. That simple kindness mattered more than he probably realized. People often rush to change painful subjects. Julian simply stayed with them. Somehow that felt easier. The cafe owner eventually announced they would be closing in 15 minutes. Neither of us had noticed nearly 2 hours had passed. "I should probably let you get home," Julian said. "Probably." Neither of us stood. Finally, he smiled. "I don't usually do this." I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Ask strangers if they'd like to meet again." I felt my heart beat just a little faster. "I'm glad." "Glad? You decided to make an exception." For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely nervous. "Would you like to?" I answered before fear had the chance. "I would." He handed me his phone. We exchanged numbers. The moment felt surprisingly ordinary. No dramatic music. No impossible coincidence. Just two people deciding they wanted another conversation. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. We walked to the corner together before our paths separated. "I guess this is where we go different ways," Julian said. "For tonight." His smile returned. "For tonight." I watched him disappear down the opposite sidewalk before turning toward my apartment. My phone buzzed before I'd reached the next traffic light. Unknown number. "I forgot to ask your favorite coffee order. That seems like important information." I laughed quietly to myself. Then I typed back, "Only if you're planning to remember it." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. I was hoping I would. For the first time in longer than I could remember, tomorrow felt like something worth looking forward to. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For a few seconds, I couldn't understand why. Then I remembered the message. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. There it was. A short conversation that had somehow stayed with me long after I had fallen asleep. "Julian, I was hoping I would." I smiled without realizing it. It wasn't because of the words themselves. It was because they felt sincere. In a world where conversations disappeared as quickly as they began, sincerity had become surprisingly rare. Later that afternoon, another message arrived. "There's a little cafe beside Riverside Park. Best cinnamon rolls in the city. Interested in finding out whether that's true?" I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Only if you're prepared for honest criticism." His answer came almost instantly. I wouldn't expect anything less. Saturday morning greeted the city with clear blue skies. The rain had washed everything clean. Leaves shimmered beneath fresh sunlight, and the air carried that quiet freshness that only appeared after a storm. The cafe was smaller than I expected. Warm brick walls, wooden tables, and shelves filled with plants made it feel more like someone's living room than a business. Julian was already there. He stood as I walked inside. "You came. I said I would." "I know." He laughed softly. "I was just happy to see you." Something about the way he said it made my heartbeat stumble for just a moment. Not because it sounded romantic, because it sounded genuine. We ordered coffee and, after much discussion, 1 cinnamon roll to share. "I refuse to eat an entire one by myself," Julian declared. "That's either wisdom or fear. A little of both." The cinnamon roll turned out to be excellent. "I hate admitting you're right," I said. "You'll get used to it." "I doubt that." "We'll see." The conversation flowed as naturally as it had inside the bookstore. There were no awkward pauses demanding to be filled. Silence arrived now and then, but it never felt uncomfortable. It simply became another part of being together. After breakfast, we wandered through Riverside Park. Children chased one another across the grass while cyclists passed along the riverside path. The world seemed unhurried. Julian stopped beside a street musician playing a gentle melody on an old violin. He listened until the final note faded into the breeze. "My dad loved music like this," he said quietly. "It makes me feel like he's still close somehow." I understood. "I still talk to my mom sometimes." He looked at me. "Really?" "Usually when I'm editing photographs." "What do you tell her?" I smiled faintly. "Mostly that I wish she could see what I'm seeing." Julian nodded. "I think she'd be proud of you." His words settled somewhere deep inside me. No one had said that in a very long time. Over the next several weeks, meeting Julian became the easiest part of my routine. Sometimes we explored used bookstores. Sometimes we visited small art galleries. Other evenings, we simply walked through quiet neighborhoods after sunset, talking about everything and nothing. I learned that he never rushed through museums. He stopped to read every small description beneath each painting. He always ordered tea after 6 in the evening because coffee kept him awake. He collected old postcards from places he'd never visited. He laughed with his whole face. And whenever someone needed help carrying groceries or opening a difficult door, he never hesitated. Little things. The kind most people overlooked. the kind I couldn't stop noticing. One afternoon, he visited my apartment for the first time. "I hope you don't mind the mess," I said as I unlocked the door. He looked around. Books rested in uneven stacks beside the sofa. Framed photographs leaned against walls waiting to be hung. Camera lenses occupied nearly every available shelf. "It looks lived in. I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one." He wandered slowly through the room before stopping in front of a framed photograph. It showed my mother standing beneath a giant oak tree, smiling toward someone outside the frame. "You took this?" "No. My dad did." Julian studied the picture carefully. "She looks happy." "She was." I swallowed. "I think that's why it's my favorite." He didn't offer empty sympathy. Instead, he simply stood beside me. Sometimes, presence spoke more loudly than words ever could. As autumn slowly settled over the city, our friendship deepened in quiet, ordinary ways. Good morning messages became normal. We recommended books to one another. We exchanged photographs of sunsets whenever we happened to see beautiful skies. If one of us had a difficult day, the other somehow seemed to know. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't complicated. It simply felt safe. One Friday evening, we attended a small photography exhibition together. Visitors wandered between framed landscapes while soft piano music drifted through the gallery. Julian stopped in front of one photograph longer than all the others. It showed an empty train station just before sunrise. "I love this one," he whispered. "Why?" "It reminds me that empty places don't stay empty forever." His answer lingered in my thoughts long after we left. Outside, the streets glowed beneath rows of golden lights. The evening air had turned cool. As we crossed a small bridge overlooking the river, Julian rested his hands on the railing. "Can I admit something?" "Of course." "When we met in that bookstore," he smiled to himself, "I almost walked out without saying anything." "Really? I saw you looking at books and thought." He laughed quietly. "He probably wants to be left alone." I almost left too. "You did." I told myself there was no reason to bother a stranger. Julian looked toward the water. "I'm glad neither of us listened." "So am I." For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The city carried on around us, unaware that two ordinary people were standing on a bridge, quietly grateful for a chance meeting that had already begun to change them both. As we started walking again, I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. I no longer looked forward to interesting places. I looked forward to seeing them with Julian. And somehow, without either of us saying it aloud, I had the feeling he might have been thinking the very same thing. By the time October arrived, the city had traded its summer warmth for crisp mornings and amber leaves. Without planning it, Julian and I had become part of each other's ordinary lives. Monday evenings often ended with coffee. Saturday mornings usually meant wandering through bookstores or quiet streets with our cameras. Neither of us had ever called it a routine. But when something becomes the best part of your week, you stop needing a name for it. One Thursday afternoon, I sent Julian a photograph of the old bookstore where we had first met. The windows glowed against the gray sky. "Me, looks like rain again." His reply didn't come. That wasn't unusual. He was often busy with work. Hours passed. Then evening. Still nothing. The next morning, there was only a short message. "Sorry. Long day." I smiled to myself and typed back, "Hope today is kinder." He reacted with a simple heart. Normally, that would have been enough. But something felt different. Not wrong. Just quieter. The following weekend, we had planned to visit a photography market together. I arrived 10 minutes early. Julian was never late. I checked my phone. No message. 5 more minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, my phone buzzed. "I'm really sorry. Something came up." "Rain check." I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to ask what had happened. Another part reminded me that everyone deserved privacy. "Of course," I replied. "Take care of yourself." His answer came almost immediately. "Thank you for understanding." But understanding didn't make disappointment disappear. I walked through the market alone. The old cameras, handmade prints, and smiling vendors were exactly as we'd imagined. Yet everything felt strangely incomplete. I kept turning toward things I wanted to show him, only to remember he wasn't there. Over the next 2 weeks, little changes became impossible to ignore. Our conversations grew shorter. His replies arrived hours later instead of minutes. Whenever I suggested meeting, he apologized and promised. Soon. Soon never seemed to arrive. I told myself not to overthink it. People became busy. Life changed. It didn't always mean something was wrong. Still, the silence found its way into places words couldn't reach. One rainy Tuesday evening, I wandered into Hawthorne Books alone. Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly owner, looked up from the register. "No Julian today?" I forced a smile. "I guess not." She nodded thoughtfully. "You two always brighten this place." I wasn't sure how to answer. Did we? Had people really begun thinking of us as a pair? The thought stayed with me as I browsed the shelves. Near the poetry section, I found the novel Julian had recommended weeks earlier. Inside the front cover, someone had written in pencil, "The people who matter most often arrive quietly." I closed the book gently. For some reason, those words hurt. 3 days later, my phone finally rang. "Julian." I answered immediately. "Hey." His voice sounded tired. "Hi." For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I've been a terrible friend." "Julian." "No, let me say it." He sighed softly. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize for being busy. It's more than that." His words stopped. Another long silence. "I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to explain tonight." "I think I do." "But not if you're not ready." He let out a quiet breath. "Thank you." We talked for only a few more minutes, mostly about work. The weather. Nothing important. Yet after we hung up, I realized we'd carefully avoided the one conversation we both needed. A week later, I accepted a last-minute photography assignment at a local publishing event. As I adjusted my camera, I caught sight of someone familiar across the room. Julian. He stood beside a woman about our age. She laughed at something he had said. He smiled back. They looked comfortable together, comfortable enough to make my chest tighten. Before I could think better of it, I turned away. I finished my work quickly and slipped out before the event ended. I never gave him the chance to see me. That evening, my phone rang 3 times. I couldn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I wasn't sure what I was feeling. Confused, disappointed, afraid. Every old fear I'd spent years burying seemed to return at once. Maybe I had misunderstood everything. Maybe I'd mistaken kindness for something deeper. Maybe the connection I believed we shared had only existed in my imagination. A message appeared just before midnight. "Rowan, I saw the event photos online. Were you there?" I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I answered honestly, "Yes." His reply came within seconds. "Why didn't you say hello?" My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I finally typed the only thing that felt true. "You looked like you were having an important conversation. I didn't want to interrupt." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, returned again. Finally, one message arrived. "Please don't assume you know what you saw." I frowned. Before I could reply, another message followed. "Can we meet tomorrow evening? There's something I should have told you a long time ago." I read those words again and again. Whatever tomorrow held, I knew one thing with quiet certainty. The distance between us hadn't been created by a lack of caring. It had been built by unspoken fears. For the first time since the silence began, I felt something other than uncertainty. I felt hope, fragile, careful, but unmistakably there. As I set my phone on the bedside table, rain began tapping gently against the window once more. I barely slept that night. Every possible explanation found its way into my thoughts. Maybe Julian had met someone. Maybe he had simply realized we wanted different things. Or maybe the distance I'd been feeling had nothing to do with me at all. Morning arrived too slowly. I threw myself into editing photographs, but every few minutes I found myself checking the clock instead of my screen. By evening, I was standing outside Hawthorne Books. The rain had returned, just as it had on the night we first met. Somehow that felt fitting. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. Julian was already there. He sat at the same corner table where we had shared our first coffee months ago. When he looked up, he smiled. It wasn't the easy smile I knew so well. It carried relief, nervousness, and more than a little fear. "You came." I said I would. For a moment, we simply looked at one another. Then he stood. "Coffee?" I smiled faintly. "I think we should." A few minutes later, warm mugs rested between us. Neither of us reached for them. "I owe you the truth," Julian said quietly. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He folded his hands together, searching for the right words. "The woman you saw at the publishing event." I waited. "Her name is Sophie." I nodded. "She's my editor." I blinked. "Your editor?" He gave a small laugh. "I've been illustrating a children's book. You never told me. I wanted it to be a surprise." He looked down at his coffee. But then deadlines became longer. Meetings became more frequent. I kept thinking I'd explain everything after one more week. His smile faded. Instead, every week made it harder. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "So, that's why you disappeared?" He nodded. Partly. There was another reason." Silence settled gently around us. Outside, rain traced quiet lines across the window. I was scared. I frowned. "Of what?" Julian looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Of how much you had started to matter." The words landed softly, but they changed everything. "I've spent years convincing myself not to depend on people," he continued. "When my dad died, I promised myself I'd never let one person become the center of my world again." His voice was steady. "But then you came into my life." He smiled sadly. "And ordinary days suddenly became the best days." I couldn't find the right words. So I listened. "I realized I looked forward to your messages." He laughed quietly. "I started noticing things because I wanted to tell you about them later. The first autumn leaves. A funny dog in the park. A book I thought you'd love." He met my eyes. "And that frightened me." I finally spoke. "You thought pulling away would make it easier." He nodded once. "I thought if I created enough distance now." His voice became quieter. "It would hurt less later." I looked down at my hands. "You know what hurt?" He swallowed. "What?" "The distance." His shoulders fell. "I'm sorry. I wasn't angry." I shook my head. "I was afraid." He looked confused. "Afraid that I'd imagined everything." "You didn't." "I thought maybe I had mistaken kindness for something more." His expression softened. "Rowan, you've become important to me too." The words escaped before I could stop them. "I didn't plan for that. I wasn't looking for it. But somewhere between coffee shops, bookstores, and long walks," I smiled faintly, "you became the person I wanted to tell everything." Julian's eyes glistened. "I've wanted to tell you the same thing for weeks." Neither of us rushed the silence that followed. There was no dramatic moment. No perfect speech. Only two people finally saying what fear had kept hidden. After a while, Julian reached into his backpack. "I made something." He placed a hardcover book on the table. Across the cover was a watercolor illustration of a quiet bookstore glowing on a rainy evening. I stared at it. "It's beautiful." He smiled. "Open it." Inside the front page, he had written a short dedication. "For Rowan. Thank you for reminding me that some stories begin the moment we decide not to walk away." I read the words twice before looking back at him. "You dedicated this to me? You've been part of the story from the beginning." Emotion tightened my throat. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to." We left the bookstore just as the rain began to slow. The streets shimmered beneath rows of golden lights. Without thinking, we wandered toward the riverside where we had walked so many evenings before. The river moved quietly beside us. "I can't promise I'll never be afraid again," Julian admitted. "I'll probably overthink things. I'll probably retreat when life gets difficult." I smiled. "And I'll probably assume the worst before asking questions." He laughed. "So maybe we both have things to learn." "I think that's true." He stopped walking and turned toward me. What if we learn together? The question was simple. There was no pressure in it. Only hope. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I'd like that. We continued walking beneath the clearing sky. For the first time since the silence had begun, neither of us felt the need to fill every moment with words. Sometimes understanding arrived quietly. Sometimes healing began with a conversation that should have happened sooner. And sometimes the bravest thing two people could do was choose honesty over fear. As the clouds slowly drifted apart, a single star appeared above the river. It wasn't a dramatic ending. It was something better. It was a new beginning. Some people believe love arrives with fireworks. Looking back now, I think it arrives much more quietly than that. It arrives in ordinary mornings, in messages asking if you've eaten lunch, in someone remembering how you take your coffee without ever having to ask again. It arrives so gently that, by the time you notice it, it has already made itself at home. After that evening by the river, Julian and I made each other a simple promise. No disappearing. No guessing what the other person was thinking. No allowing fear to speak louder than honesty. It wasn't a perfect promise. We were still human. But every relationship, I had learned, wasn't built by never making mistakes. It was built by choosing to repair them. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The city seemed to wake from a long sleep. Cherry blossoms appeared along the riverside paths. Cafes moved their tables outdoors again. And the bookstore where everything had begun looked even more welcoming beneath clear blue skies. Julian's children's book was finally published. The launch wasn't held in a grand theater or an expensive hotel. Instead, Hawthorne Books offered its little reading corner for the celebration. Mrs. Alvarez decorated the shelves with paper stars and tiny watercolor illustrations copied from the book. Children filled the room with excited whispers. Parents smiled proudly. When Julian read the opening pages aloud, I stood quietly at the back with my camera. Not because anyone had asked me to, because I wanted to remember the moment forever. Every smile on his face felt genuine. Every laugh sounded lighter than it had months before. When the event ended, he walked toward me carrying a freshly signed copy. This one's different. How? He opened the cover. Inside, beneath his signature, he had written, "For Rowan. Thank you for believing in my stories before I believed in them myself." I closed the book carefully. "I'm running out of ways to thank you." He smiled. "Then don't." Life never became perfect. Some weeks were exhausting. Photography jobs were canceled without warning. Publishing deadlines stole Julian's weekends. We still argued occasionally, usually over small things. Who forgot to reply to a message? Who worked too much? Who insisted they weren't tired when they clearly were? But something had changed. Instead of walking away, we talked. Instead of assuming, we asked. Instead of protecting ourselves with silence, we trusted each other with the truth. Little by little, those choices built something stronger than either of us had expected. One Saturday morning, Julian appeared at my apartment carrying 2 coffees and an envelope. "I have another surprise. Should I be worried?" "Only a little." Inside the envelope were 2 train tickets. I looked up. "The coast." He nodded. "You once told me your mom loved photographing sunrises by the ocean." "I did. I thought." He smiled nervously. "Maybe we could watch one together." The journey took only a few hours. By dawn the next morning, we stood on a quiet beach with waves rolling gently onto the shore. The world was almost completely silent. Only the sea and the wind filled the space around us. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The horizon slowly changed from deep blue to soft gold. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the water, turning every wave into liquid glass. I lifted my camera, then lowered it again. Julian noticed. "You're not taking a picture?" I smiled. "Some moments deserve to be lived before they're photographed." He nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." For a while, we simply watched the sunrise together. Felt strangely familiar. As though we'd been walking toward this moment since the rainy evening we first reached for the same book. On the drive home, Julian looked out the window before speaking. "Do you remember the sign above the bookstore? Stories find people?" He smiled. "I used to think it was just clever advertising." And now I think it might have been true. I laughed softly. I think so too. Months later, life settled into a rhythm that felt wonderfully ordinary. Friends often invited us to dinners. Mrs. Alvarez always saved our favorite table near the cafe window. My photographs began appearing in local exhibitions more often. Julian started sketching ideas for his second book. Sometimes we spent entire evenings reading in comfortable silence. Sometimes we stayed up talking until sunrise. Neither felt more important than the other, because happiness, I had learned, wasn't made of dramatic moments. It was built from countless quiet ones. Every now and then, I still returned to the exact shelf where we had first met. The old copy of The Night Circus was usually gone. Someone else had borrowed it. Someone else had begun their own story. I liked that thought. One rainy evening, almost exactly a year after we first met, Julian slipped his hand gently into mine as we stood outside Hawthorne Books. No one noticed. No one needed to. It wasn't about making a grand statement. It was about feeling at home. I looked toward the glowing bookstore windows and smiled. A single decision had changed everything. Not a dramatic choice. Not a heroic one. Just the simple decision to stay a little longer on a rainy evening. To share a cup of coffee. To listen. To be honest. To let someone see the parts of me I'd spent years hiding. Love hadn't arrived like a storm. It had arrived like sunrise. Slowly. Patiently. Almost unnoticed. Until suddenly the whole world looked brighter. And if there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. The most beautiful stories rarely begin with certainty. They begin with kindness, with courage, and with two people willing to believe that, even after loss and loneliness, a new chapter is always waiting to be written.